Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna, everybody. Hope you can all see my screen and you can hear me.
Yep. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. So last week we covered until verse 22, if I remember it right. Yes. So we'll continue from verse number 23. So this is ongoing discussion on the nature of the soul, the quality of the soul, which Krishna is describing to Arjuna. Verse number 23. It's a very famous verse. Possible, you should try to memorize. You can add it to the list of verses that are recommended for memorization. So this will be one of them. Nainam chindanti sastrani, nainam dahati pavakaha, na chainam kledayanti apo, na soshiyati marutaha. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Translation: the soul can never be cut to pieces by any weapon, nor burned by fire, nor moistened by water, nor withered by the wind. So out of the 5 elements, the 4 elements are described over here, and it says that none of them have any effect on the soul, right? So trying to cut anything is generally by a physical means, which involves a physical object. Could be a sword, or it could be something that is more microscopic, but it's still something that is sharp, right? And it's made up of earth, right? And then after earth, the other element is fire. Say that the fire does not have any effect on the soul does not get burnt. Subtler than fire is water, and then water cannot moisten the soul, and subtler than water is wind, and the wind cannot dry it or wither it. And subtler than wind again or air is ether, And then subtler than ether is mind, intelligence, and none of these elements they have any kind of effect on the soul. So in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is mentioning that if you look at most, if you try to classify weapons into different categories, most weapons in the contemporary world, right, is generally some form of bombs or either bullets or projectiles. So either they're made up of earth or water, sorry, earth or fire, right? So any kind of bombs, even up on, including nuclear weapons, they use extreme kind of heat for explosion, which falls in the category of fire. Or if you have projectiles like missiles, right? Again, they explode. But even on collision itself, they do damage. So maybe a better example is bullets. So bullets, they are projectiles, and they're made up of metal, so it can come under the category of earth, right? So most weapons that we are familiar with in the contemporary time, either they are made up of earth or fire. But in previous ages, the Kshatriyas being trained even in mystical abilities, right? So part of military training, again, uh, apart from using the weapons, is also uh, by invoking different chants. They could, or by reciting different chants or mantras, they could invoke weapons. And because this falls under the category of mysticism, in the sense that they are able to um, manipulate all the five elements of matter just by chanting mantras. So mantras again is in the platform of ether. From ether develops air, from air develops water, from water develops fire, and from fire develops earth. So the foundation, all of that, of all the five elements, again, is on an ethereal platform where the mantras are chanted. So these mantras are potent to basically, manipulate subtler elements of matter. So not just fire and earth that most weapons of the contemporary world are made up of, but even you could invoke fire weapons or air weapons, right, or water weapons. Sometimes they use water cannons, not in war, but there is civil unrest, then the forces, the domestic uh, law enforcement agencies, sometimes they use water cannon to control the crowd. And so it is powerful, but it's not lethal, right? So that's another example of weapon which is not lethal. But anyway, all these elements could be manipulated to in a lethal way to hurt others. And so here we find descriptions in Mahabharata and Ramayana. The Kshatriyas were able to invoke this kind of weapons. But nonetheless, the soul can never be cut into pieces, and that's what Srila Prabhupada is mentioning over here. Doesn't matter, so nor can it be annihilated by any weapons. Yeah, because soul is again subtler than the subtlest of all matter, right? So it doesn't, cannot have any effect of any of these gross elements or even subtle elements for that matter. The Mayavadi, those who believe that the absolute truth is a homogeneous spirit, right? So the idea of the impersonalists, Mayavadi is a category of the impersonalists. There are two kinds of impersonalists. One is Brahmavadis, who don't have knowledge about the absolute transcendental form of the Lord, but nevertheless they are not envious, or they do not deny the existence of the form of the Lord. It's just that they don't have knowledge. But there is another class of impersonalists. Their idea is that even the Supreme Spirit can come under the illusion of Maya. Maya is illusion, And that's why they are known as Mayavadis. Vada means philosophy, or a particular perspective or thought. And so this particular class of impersonalists, their idea is that everyone, even including the Supreme Spirit, can be subject to illusion. And so once everything is subject to illusion, this class of philosophers are known as Mayavadis. But then they say that if, despite of coming under illusion, one can actually overcome the illusion, and when they overcome the illusion, they can again merge into the absolute spirit and again become homogeneous. So their idea of Brahman, or the absolute truth, is one that of homogeneity. So here Srila Prabhupada is mentioning that this theory again does not have any basis in the scriptures, though some kind of interpretation is wrangled out, rather misinterpretation of the verses from scriptures. So they use this philosophy, but Prabhupada is saying, according to this philosophy, if one follows that, one cannot explain that how exactly does the individual soul come into being simply by ignorance and then become covered by the illusory energy. So the idea is that, well, the absolute truth is again, homogeneous form of spirit. So the example that they give is just like an ocean or a large body of water is made up of different molecules of water. And then when few droplets of water are separated from that large body, they come, they have their individual existence. But when you again merge, or again again you merge those droplets, or put those droplets back into that body of water, then they lose their existence. So the ultimate truth is that it's homogeneity, where there is they don't have individual existence, right? Just like water droplets, they might assume an independent existence, but that is temporary. When they merge again back into the larger body of water, they lose their existence. So they give this example that Brahman is like that. Brahman does not is a homogeneous spirit where no one has an individual existence, but then the spirit soul separates from the Brahman when it comes under the influence of ignorance. And then it gets covered by Maya, but eventually that spirit soul can achieve perfection and again retain its original state. So Srila Prabhupada is essentially questioning over here that how exactly, if you say the ultimate truth is a homogeneous form where no one has an individual existence, so if that is a hypothesis, right? So if we accept that statement, then how does a portion of that homogeneous form who does not have an independent existence gets affected by illusion? And how do you divide it, right? So if you say it's a large homogeneous spirit, then how does some fractions, and how do you define, because none of them have an individual existence, right? So how do you define that if none of them have an identity, then there is no question of that identity being subject to illusion. First of all, that identity needs to be defined, right? And if you say there is no identity to begin with, then how is there is no question of that identity being subject to illusion, and hence it is separated from the homogeneous spirit. So that there is no answer. So Srila Prabhupada is pointing out that fault in that philosophy. So does it make sense? This particular sentence is where Srila Prabhupada commented that. So hope it makes sense. If not, please don't hesitate to ask. I think it's very important to understand the fundamental difference between the Vaishnava philosophy and the impersonal philosophy. Nor was it ever possible to cut the individual souls from the original supreme soul, right? So here, right over here, it says that the soul cannot be cut. Right? Soul can never be cut into any pieces. Nainam chindanti sastrani. Chindanti means to cut into pieces. Nainam, never. Sastrani is by weapons. So if the soul or the spirit cannot be cut into pieces, if we accept this statement, which we should, it's from the scriptures, then how is it that the Supreme Spirit, the Supreme Spirit is also indivisible? If it is indivisible, how is it that the individual souls, they are separated from that Supreme Spirit Brahman, and they come under the influence of illusion, right? That makes no sense, because here the statement right over here, it says that the soul cannot be cut into pieces. So nor was it ever possible to cut the individual souls from the original Supreme Soul. Rather, the individual souls are eternally separated from the Supreme Soul. So the idea is that the proper understanding is that the souls, they always have an independent existence, whether they are under the influence of illusion, ignorance, or even when they overcome ignorance and achieve spiritual perfection, they don't lose the individuality. So it is a perfect existence in a spiritually liberated state, but that doesn't mean that one loses one's identity. Because they are atomic individual souls eternally, sanatana, uh, sometimes they are prone to be influenced by the illusory energy of the Lord. And when that happens, they become separated from the association of the Lord, just as the sparks of fire, although one in quality with the fire, are prone to be extinguished when they are out of the fire. So here also there is another analogy. Well, one might question, like, again, if the fire is homogeneous, how is it that the spark of the fire is separated? So again, we are not proposing that theory. But what it says is that just like when we see a bonfire, right, it's a large fire, and when the fire is burning, the sparks of fire may come out, right? We actually see with our eyes. In the top of the flames, you can see some sparks actually come out, and they come out and drop on the ground. And so when they drop on the ground, they initially, for a minute or half a minute, they might have some fiery spirit. It's still sort of glowing. But what happens is, in due course of time, it gets it gets exhausted. The fiery spirit, the fiery nature goes away, and it just becomes it merges with matter. And so similarly, we are spirit souls. We always have our individual identity, even in our in our spiritually liberated state, and we continue to retain our spiritual or fiery nature as long as we associate with other spiritual beings, or we are we are in a spiritual environment. But what happens is, when we don't associate with other spiritually minded people, or then we become overwhelmed by the illusory energy of the Lord, right? And so just like those sparks, when they are not in contact with the bonfire, then they lose their fiery nature. Similarly, the spirit soul, when it is already covered by subtle and gross matter, which is our body, and this body is attracted by sense objects, the five senses, they are attracted by the sense objects, which are external material forms, right? Which is things that we like to see, like the eyes like to see, forms which are, or things which are pleasant to look at, and the tongue likes to savor very tasty food. Ears, they like to listen to nice music. And so in this way, the senses, they are pulled by different sense objects. And when one is not trained in understanding what is one's real nature, what is our real identity, what is soul, how is it different from gross and subtle body, then again one is influenced by these material coverings and the sense objects towards which the body is attracted, and then one loses one's spiritual identity. So that is the understanding. Yeah, so just as the sparks of fire, although one in quality with the fire, are prone to be extinguished when out of fire, similarly the souls are also subject to illusion. In the Varaha Puran, living entities are described as separated parts and parcels of the Supreme. Here, separated means uh, they have an individual identity from the Lord, right? It's not that they came into being at a certain point in time, that we already discussed in the previous verse. So somebody might say that here separated means that, well, they were part of the, they were homogeneous with the Supreme Spirit and then they got separated. That's not what it means, because we earlier, in the previous verse, we already, a couple of verses ago, we already discussed that the soul always, existed. Krishna says that there was never a time, Arjuna, when you did not exist. There was never a time where the kings did not exist. Same thing, so he mentions that. So the individual identity is always there. Here, separated means that it's not that he came into separation at certain point in time, but that they are always separated. So even after being liberated from illusion, the living entity remains a separate identity, as is evident from the teachings of Krishna to Arjuna. So Arjuna ultimately becomes liberated by the knowledge he receives from Krishna, but that does not mean he becomes one with Krishna in the sense that he loses his identity. That's not the purport of it. So after listening to Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna actually realizes his original nature and he acts according to it, but not that he becomes one with Krishna and loses his identity. So that is the understanding of this verse. Anyone has any questions on this topic before we move on? Yes. Yeah. Yes, Kashyap.
Uh, I actually saw a couple of videos related to the similar topics, like about the individuality of the soul once it is liberated and leave the prakriti, right? So basically, body, mind, and intellect are part of the prakriti, and the this the atma that actually connects with this prakriti is what called jivatma. And
Yes.
if it is able to figure out how to disconnect itself with the prakriti, uh, then um, there is no two things there, basically, because it is no more seeing it as a prakriti or purusha. It's like they got disconnected, completely disconnected. That means there is no two things there. There is only one thing existed. That's what was the discussion. And the analogy that they provided is the same thing that you mentioned before, when there is a sea and a lot of water. So the deep sea is stable um, without any variations to it. But when it comes to the edge of the sea, where there is a lot of waves coming here and there, but it's still part of the sea. But if you see wave individually, the wave is a wave, but actually it is still part of the sea. But when waves matches back into the sea, it's still part of the sea. So it is never separated. It's only the a part that is actually trying to connect to the prakriti is what is the identity. But identity is basically in the mind, right? Mind is a part of prakriti. So once it stopped identifying it with prakriti, then there is no purusha at all. It's all part of parabrahma or paramatma. That's the explanation I heard, which is at that time I find very convincing. But I just wanted to bring it up here so that maybe we can discuss about it and see things around it. I hope
Yeah.
I'm clear.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So this example of water or air, is generally quoted by Mayavadis, who, they are trying to prove the point that only in our conditioned state of life, that means when one is under illusion, that's the only time that one has a separate identity, because one is trying to be separated from the spirit. That's what they say. But once, when one achieves perfection, then that illusion of being separate from the Lord is removed, and so then one becomes, one merges back into the absolute truth. So that's their argument, or that's the hypothesis. And in order to prove that, they give examples like the water example, right? So the water body, so on the surface, the waves, they are kind of as if they are coming out of the water, and they, as if they're trying to get separated, but deep down, the ocean is stable, right? So that's one example they give. The other example is that, well, the sky is the same everywhere, right? And when it is contained within a pot, then it appears that, it is separated from the homogeneous sky which is existing everywhere. But as soon as you break the pot, again that sky which was contained within the pot now merges with uh, the overall sky which is existing everywhere. And so these are different examples by which they try to prove their point. uh, the so so you can come up with different analogies, but it does not establish the truth. So in in the scriptures, in the Puranas, in the Brahma Sutras, the word often that is used is Advaita, right? Advaita means one without any duality, right? So one one without duality, that word is interpreted in different ways to come up with, to justify their theory. So what they say is that Advait, the Mayavadis, they say Advait means that, well, there is no difference between the soul and the super soul. They are one in all respects. And that's what the real meaning of the Advaita means. That's what their philosophy is. But the Vaishnavas, they understand here Advaita means that one without second. The duality over here is that one is qualitatively same as the Lord. That does not mean that one is equal to the Lord in all respects. So there is this fundamental difference, right? So there is another verse in Srimad Bhagavatam. Let me pull it out. It says, I think we discussed this in the past, the Supreme Spirit has can be perceived in three different levels of truth, right? So one is Brahman, right? Second is Paramatma, and third is Bhagavan, right? So Brahma iti, Paramatma iti, Bhagavan iti sabdyate. So this verse appears in Srimad Bhagavatam. So here, in that verse, the word Advayam is used, right? So Advayam, Brahman iti, Paramatma iti, Bhagavan iti sabdyate, right? So this one. So Vadanti Tat, Tattva Vidas, those who are learned souls, they say that the absolute truth, right? Yad Jnanam, Advayam. So the absolute truth is non-dual, right? So the Advayam word appears here also, right? But here the word Advayam means that this knowledge is absolute. It's one without second, right? So Jnanam, Yad Jnanam Advayam, right? So because it does not have any duality, it is absolute. But that non-dual substance actually is not homogeneous. It is differentiated into three different categories, which is the Brahman, it's the Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So in the Brahman, there are individual souls, right? These are liberated souls. And all these liberated souls, each of them have their individual identity. First of all, they are all different. So they are like, just like in the sunlight, you'd see a lot of dust particles or even photons or the light particles, but each of them, they have their individual identity. So the Brahman effulgence that is coming out from the spiritual planets or the transcendental form of the Lord, in that effulgence, the souls, they are floating, right? But that doesn't mean that they lose their identity. Just like they're in the dust particles, they are floating in the sky, right? But each of them have their identity. So first of all, they have individual identity that is unique compared to other souls, which is Brahman. On top of that, they are again different from Paramatma. So Paramatma is a completely different category. And then beyond Paramatma again is Bhagavan. So Paramatma is localized form of the Supreme Lord, right? And then the Bhagavan is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Just like there is sunlight, then there's sun globe, right? And then the personality of the demigod of sun, right? So each of them, they are three different individuals. So yes, they comprise a non-dual substance, right? And that's why it's called Advayam. But that Advayam is misinterpreted by Mayavadis. In Mayavadis, they say Advayam means, well, there is no difference between the soul and the super soul. Well, if there is no difference, then these three categories are not mentioned separately. So this individuality always exists. So that is a point of difference between the impersonalist theory and the philosophy of Vaishnavas, right? So that's their fundamental difference. So if you go back to the verses which Krishna is mentioning, so first of all, he's saying, well, there was never a time that you did not exist. That applies even to the liberated state. Nor the soul can be cut into pieces. If the soul is not cut into pieces, then how is it that the soul is separated from the Supreme Brahman, right? Even when the soul is part of Brahman, which is what this verse is talking about, the soul is retaining its identity, right? So the Brahman can comprise of many souls. It does actually. The Brahman effulgence, there are many liberated souls who are just floating around, but because they don't have the idea of the personality of Godhead, they are not engaging in active pastimes with the Lord, in the five relationships, as a neutral relation, as a servant, as a friend, as a parent, or a conjugal lover. So there is not an active engagement. So it's passive, but they still have their identity. So with that understanding, we don't we don't contradict this truth that the soul can never be cut. Otherwise, if if you to follow the idea of the impersonalists, the Mayavadis, then one has to come up with this theory that one loses the existence and then one is separated. But how can it be separated? Like, how do you chunk it out? Like, is it sometimes some pieces are larger pieces, some pieces are smaller pieces, right? How does that happen? So there is no basis to that argument, and so that is the sum and substance of the essence of the explanation that Srila Prabhupada is providing. And it could become quite technical actually. If you look at the verses in the scriptures, how you interpret them, and unless one scrutinizingly studies the subtle points, the philosophies or the arguments could sound very convincing, and and that's why this idea of impersonalism is very popular, right? It's prevalent all over the world, especially in India. The interpretations of Sankaracharya, those commentaries, they still have influence. Nobody studies those systematically, but the idea is very much prevalent. So this is the I just tried to summarize what I stated earlier, but I hope that clarifies and the point that you brought up, some of the examples that you provided. If needed, we can discuss this further. Does that help?
Oh yeah, you rightly said. I think we previously discussed some part of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
Do you want to
we
say
can
something? Yeah. Go ahead.
we can actually continue. Basically, when you're talking talking, I actually got a reference in Bhagavatam, where I was reading about Kapila Maharshi is actually trying to give Brahmajnanam to his mother. He says it all started because imbalance in
The
imbalance three gunas,
yes,
sattva, rajas, and
yes.
uh,
Pradhan,
tamo gunas.
yeah, the Pradhan
So
body balanced, and then yes, then all the creation
uh,
happens. Yeah.
yeah, right. So how do I put this into that context? Like, so what I understand is sattva, rajas, and tamo gunas are actually part of prakriti, which was a part of again Parabrahma itself. If I see in a way some kind of a manifestation of Parabrahma itself is prakriti. So and the sattva raja gunas are actually part of prakriti. So an imbalance in that created the universe, or everything is started. Is it for universe? Is it for souls, or is it for what? And it is. I see it as a bubble of prakriti have all these changes, but out of this bubble of prakriti, it is still Parabrahma itself, right? And if I see it as a bubble of prakriti and Parabrahma is outside of it, and Parabrahma, wherever it is touching that bubble, I can see it as, the part of Parabrahma is actually get associated with prakriti, and that's where the souls can be. I might be, these are all my imagination. I might be wrong, but when I read that, I could not. I mean, I'm trying to connect these dots correctly. The souls. Ha, somewhere I also read that
Yeah.
there is no starting and there is no ending. Right? There is everything is there from forever. There is like Najanma, something I don't remember the names, but so it is there is no starting, there is no ending, and the souls are there from forever, and at the same time the Prakriti is also there from ever, and that means Parabrahma is also there from ever, and it's all connected. So yeah, it's all a bit confusing. There are two theories, as you said, and both are really confusing. But uh, it is actually hard for someone very new who don't have any bias to both of them to figure out which is the we should go forward.
Well, okay, so I think you raised a couple of different questions. Well, one, I think, and those are separate questions. So one is which one is right, whether the Mayavadi theory is right or whether the understanding of the Vaishnavas is right. And if it doesn't require a lot of intelligence, in the sense that if you take into account all the different aspects, it's very easy to understand, right? So when you talk about truth, and if there are different theories, the real or the absolute truth is one that encompasses all other forms of truth, right? So give an example is, suppose a child, in elementary school is learning just math or learning how to count, right? And uh, can do addition, subtraction. Now, if that child comes over a textbook of his elder sibling and like, hey, what are you studying? I'm studying math. Okay, let me see the book. In the book, he comes across sine A or calculus. What do you mean sine A? Like sin A, right? Cosines. This is like English. What is this? Is some gibberish. Say, no, this is math. No, I don't believe you. It makes no sense. I see there's a language in it. You're using different words instead of numbers, and these words also make no sense. So I don't accept that this is math, right? So one might argue like that. But those who are actually studying higher levels of mathematics, they know that this is truth, right? And what the child is studying is also truth, right? But there are just difference in gradations. So when our understanding is imperfect, then we are incomplete, or both, we cannot explain certain things, or we might just reject it. Now, if you look at the Vaishnava philosophy, there is a overall holistic understanding of not just the material creation of the Lord. They are explaining what the Brahman is. Beyond that, they are explaining what the Paramatma is and what Bhagavan is, right? So if in conversations with the impersonalists, they would never talk about spiritual planets. So suppose they say the absolute truth is Brahman, that means they are denying the Vaikuntha planets, right? They're not denying Goloka Vrindavan. They are denying all this spiritual sky. In the spiritual sky, what they are saying is that it's just homogeneous sky, and in that sky, in the spiritual sky, it's just homogeneous Brahman, and there is no variety in it. So the example is when you talk about ocean, you can say the ocean is homogeneous form of body of water, right? But what is inside the ocean? There is flora and fauna. You even go in the bottom of the seabed, you will find volcanoes sometimes, and there is coral reefs. There are fishes which are swimming in that water. There are different forms of aquatics, and there is so much variety, right? So if you really take that example of Mayavadis, they're only when they're talking about the ocean and they quoting that as an example. When they talk about that ocean, they're not talking about what is inside the ocean. There's so much variety. It's not just dull, homogeneous, uniform form of existence. Similarly, the spiritual sky, it's not dull. You see this picture over here, the spiritual sky, there are so many spiritual planets, right? And it is actually from the spiritual planets that effulgence is coming. Where is that effulgence coming from, right? So then there is no explanation for that. They don't talk about it. So as I said, the example is that you like just like different levels of mathematics. One who is studying higher levels of mathematics, they are able to explain all the different levels, right? But one who has limited understanding and is stuck into some level of truth, right? Then they cannot appreciate higher levels of understanding or gradations in that same subject, right? So that is the difference. So Mayavadis generally, they don't talk about the variety in the spiritual sky. They are just ignoring it. Just like an elementary school child who is learning elementary mathematics, they ignore the wide all the different kind of higher levels of topics which are there in mathematics, right? Or one looks at the ocean and you just say, well, ocean is just homogeneous form of body, homogeneous form, mass, a large body of water. Well, it might appear like that if you're on the shore, but if you go down and look at the ocean, okay, the water is stable down there. Okay, they talk about that, but what is there in that stable water? Well, there are still aquatics there. There is what they call stable water, actually the currents. So the surf waves, what we call surfing, right? The waves on the surface are called surfs, and you see a lot of turbulence over there. But when you talk about all the El Nino, El Nina effect, how the Atlantic current is, drifting, those currents are very strong. So it appears very stable at the bottom of the ocean, but it's not. These currents, when they go from like the northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere, where are those currents happening? The currents are not happening on the surface. The currents are actually happening deep down inside the water. Sometimes when they go to excavate different ships which have been wrecked, and they know that the ship is wrecked at this location maybe 200 years ago, they have that. They go and research and they found out, well, the ship is completely at a different location, though they knew the precise coordinates where the ship was wrecked. And they explain that, hey, this is the North Atlantic current. So once the ship wrecks and goes down, the currents actually drift that wreck ship to a different location. So it's not stable down there. So there are a lot of nuances, and when these examples are given, it's simplified. When you try to simplify, again you lose the details. So that's one way of understanding. The other way of understanding again is as I say, if Krishna says that soul always existed, the kings existed in the past, they are existing now, they will exist in the future. That means they will exist even when the soul is liberated. Now, if you say, well, the soul is separated from the homogeneous spirit, then that's not possible, because it says that soul cannot be cut, it cannot be separated, right? So if by applying some intelligence one can make distinction of what is true and what is not, right? So I hope that answers that part of the question, and then I'll try to answer the other part of the question where you're quoting Kapila Muni and how he was explaining that how Prakriti comes into being, and Prakriti is eternal. And Prakriti is different from Brahman. There is a difference between Brahman and Prakriti, but I will explain that in a moment. But before that, I want to make sure that the distinction between the Mayavadi philosophy and the Vaishnava philosophy is clear, and that there are no. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. So you're saying if we put more effort and uh, more progress towards this direction, we'll eventually discover new things around it, and that will clarify over the time. But we have to understand that there is more than what Mayavadis are saying.
No, I mean, I'm not saying that. I mean, obviously, with time, we understand anything in much more detail. That is there. But even to make distinction between, to make this differentiation between the Mayavadi theory and the Vaishnava theory, it one can even understand it in, one need not be like super advanced to make that distinction. Like some of the examples that I quoted,
Yeah, true.
right?
I got it.
Yeah. So it's not necessary. I mean, with time, again, anything, even Vaishnava philosophy also, we can understand in much more depth. That is there. But I think even at a preliminary level, one can make the distinction. And what I was trying to, say with the example when I gave the elementary versus a graduate level student in mathematics, of course, there is a time difference between those two phases. But the point I was trying to say is that holistically, when you try to, just like you have so much information, and if we are biased and we only look at certain piece of information and we ignore the remaining piece of information, then we come to an partial or an incorrect understanding of the truth, right? So when Mayavadis say, they're selectively choosing certain descriptions or certain elements, certain description in the scriptures, and they are interpreting or misinterpreting it, right?
Yeah.
Now, when you say truth, just like when you have different models that explain different things, those models should be mutually compatible, right? If you're explaining one thing, but if that model fails to explain something else, right, then there's defects in that model. But if there's a model that explains all the different aspects of the truth, then that model is complete. So what I meant to again was, with the Mayavadi philosophy, there are so many things that you cannot explain, right? So if we because they are not talking anything beyond Brahman, right? They don't talk about Vaikuntha, they don't talk about Goloka Vrindavan, right? But those descriptions are there. How do you explain that? If you say there is no variety in the spiritual world, right? If everything is homogeneous, then how do you explain those? There's a vast amount of literature that just talks about that, right? So now this does not even require any technical understanding of how you interpret this verse and that verse, right? I mean, I'm just saying it's just if you're fundamentally approaching the problem with a different perspective, where I'm saying that, okay, how do you explain the other things? You should holistically explain, right? In Srimad Bhagavatam, now another thing, Mayavadi philosophers, beginning with Shankaracharya himself, he commented on Brahma Sutras. And the Brahma Sutras, they are aphorisms which are very vague in the sense that, they don't describe the personal form of the Lord and, the pastimes. And so, there is more room for interpretation. Now, they never comment on Srimad Bhagavatam. So it's very difficult to provide a impersonalist commentary on Srimad Bhagavatam. You know, it's they might attempt some places here and there, but Srimad Bhagavatam is widely known as, you know, Vaishnava scripture. But the Vaishnavas, they not only comment on all the Puranas, including Srimad Bhagavatam, they comment on Bhagavad Gita, and they have commentary on Brahma Sutras, right? So they are holistically explaining the entire body of the Vedic literature, and they are not selectively limited to certain aspect, right? And you can ignore it, right? But then they're ignoring something, you cannot avoid it by ignoring it, right? So that's another way to look at it. If somebody says, well, you know, as a beginner, it's too much complicated to, you know, figure out which philosophy is right, then I said, okay, you don't worry about that, but look at from this perspective which I mentioned, right? You know, which philosophy explains the truth holistically, right? And then, you know, as you study this Bhagavad Gita and commentary, then you try to analyze the Mayavadi philosophy based on these truths which are mentioned, like the soul cannot be divided, or that soul is always ever existing. And so, you know, by applying some intelligence, one need not be a pandita, or, you know, but by just by applying very simple kind of logic, one can easily make distinction that there is, you know, fundamental difference, not just difference, but, you know, which one is a complete understanding of the truth. So the impersonalists, they deny the form of the Lord, right? So, you know, they when we go back to this verse from Bhagavad Puran, they deny the Bhagavan form of the Lord. It says Bhagavan is also subject to illusion, right? Or rather, Bhagavan emerges from Brahman. And when Krishna comes, actually Krishna is just a portion of Brahman, and when he came to the earth, he, you know, he was just a part and parcel of the Brahman. So they, right? But in the absolute reality, there is no Bhagavan. The different same thing with Paramatma. Paramatma and Bhagavan, they are only existing in the you know, material world. They don't exist in the spiritual world. And so their understanding of the truth is that Brahman is absolute. But the Vedic scriptures, they describe that, oh no, Paramatma and Bhagavan, you will find descriptions in Puranas that, you know, there is a spiritual realm. Even in Bhagavatam, he says three pada vibhuti, right? The remaining 75% of creation, the spiritual planets are there. So the Vaishnavas, they are able to holistically explain all aspects of it, right? We don't deny Brahman, right? The Brahman, you know, but he says Brahman is actually effulgence coming from Bhagavan, right? And they exist in the spiritual world. Now, in the impersonalist understanding, these two categories are completely denied existence in the spiritual realm. They say they can only exist in the material realm, because in the spiritual world there is no variety. The spiritual world is only homogeneous, right? So they are denying that existence. While the Vaishnavas, they say, well, there is variety both in spiritual world and material world, right? So then you holistically, when you see like, okay, which model is complete, right? You know, they are not ignoring certain descriptions. So that's just another perspective. I hope that helps answer your question. Now, coming back to your question of, you use different words like prakriti, which is, you know, material creation, or all the different variety in matter that we find. So prakriti is also eternal. And what Kapila Muni is explaining in the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam to his mother Devahuti, the description, the way it starts. So the Brahman is this light which is coming out from the spiritual planets, right? And this light is pervading the entire creation of the Lord. But the 1/4 of the creation of the Lord, this light does not reach. And that is the material world. So where we are existing, we don't see this effulgence, right? The only effulgence that we see is from the sun. When the sun is out, the sun sets, then again we don't see it. It's all dark. So 1/4 of the creation of the Supreme Lord is the material world. The remaining 3/4 creation, these effulgence, this nice light, pleasing light is always there. And there is no darkness. So why is this 1/4 of the creation subject to darkness? There is a homogeneous form, you know, a cloud of matter, which is called Mahat Tattva. Mahat means great, Tattva means principles. So the great principles of matter, where the matter is not differentiated. So sometimes scientists want to talk about the fifth state of matter. It's neither liquid nor gas, and what they something plasma they talk about. But the scriptures describe there is a state of matter where all the 24 elements of the matter that we have discussed in the past, they are not differentiated. They exist as a homogeneous substance, right? So that homogeneity is actually is homogeneity of matter, right? And so it's a cloud, and so that cloud actually covers this Brahman effulgence from entering that 1/4 part of the creation of the Lord. So there is darkness over there. Within that creation is this Mahavishnu. He is actually within that 1/4 part. He lies in this causal ocean, in the sense that this ocean, which is made up of this primordial matter, which is undifferentiated. And when he glances that Mahat Tattva, or the undifferentiated primordial matter, the matter is agitated. So the three gunas don't exist in there. The Mahat Tattva, it's just the three gunas, they are in balance. And so that state of is called Pradhan. So before Prakriti comes Pradhan. So Prakriti is not existing. It is existing in an what you call in a state which is not active, right? It is not activated. It is kind of hibernating. Think of it in that fashion. So there is no variety in it. But when the Mahavishnu glances it, that Mahat Tattva, which has these three modes in balance, it's called Pradhan, it is agitated. And when it is agitated, the imbalance is created. And that imbalance actually happens chronologically. So first, actually, what happens is that Sattva Gun becomes predominant. And the false ego, the first thing that comes into existence is when Mahavishnu glances it, it impregnates it with the idea of identity. That means identification with the matter. Aham, ahankar, that comes first. When ahankar actually comes under the influence of sattva gun, mind is created, because mind is mostly in the mode of goodness. When that ahankar comes under the influence of passion, because now there is imbalance created. So sometimes sattva is in predominance, sometimes raja is in predominance, sometimes tamo is in predominance. Intelligence is created, right? And when I say intelligence is created, these are class definition. Just like you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you define a class. So you're just defining a class doesn't mean that the object is still instantiated. So all these definitions of different forms of matters are created. And they are created in a ternary logic. Just like in digital world, everything is binary, zeros and one. In the creation of the Lord, everything is a combination of sattva, rajas, and tamas. So different proportions of it in different sequence. They create this class definition for mind. It's not the actual mind that will come. That's instantiation of that class. If you use that terminology, it happens later. And then this chitta, or contaminated consciousness, happens when that the ahankar comes under the influence of ignorance, tamoguna. So you see what happened, that pradhan, which was in perfect balance, got agitated. When it got agitated, first these three elements got created, which is mind, intelligence, and contaminated consciousness. Then mind actually further expands into 5, which is the quality of smell, quality of form, quality of taste, quality of touch, and quality of hearing. Right? Because mind is passive, and all these qualities are passive. But intelligence actually expands into 11 senses, 5 working senses and 5 knowledge acquiring senses. And the contaminated consciousness, chitta, further expands into 5 gross elements, which is earth, water, fire, air, ether. So in this way, 24 elements are created. So the point I was trying to make is that the Brahman and Mahat Tattva, they are not same, or Brahman and Prakriti are not same, they are different. Prakriti is a variety that is created from Mahat Tattva, which is basically a primordial matter. This primordial matter is actually blocking this effulgence from pervading throughout the entire creation. So the matter could be either manifested or unmanifested. So when it is manifested, it is Prakriti. So all the variety that we see in the world right now, it is Prakriti. But when it is unmanifested, it is still existing, right? When the entire creation is destroyed and there is some time before the new creation starts, it is existing in an unmanifested stage, but it's still existing. And that is known as either Mahat Tattva or Pradhan, but the Mahat Tattva has a separate identity from Brahman. So it's more like it's blocking the Brahman. So again, these are technical topics. You don't have to go there, but because you brought it up, I just wanted to make that distinction clear that these are different entities. Prakriti is not same as Brahman, or Prakriti or Mahat Tattva is different from Brahman. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay. So we can move on to the next verse, verse number 24. So here further description of the soul is given. Achedyoyam adadyoyam akledyo ashoshya evacha nitya sarvagata sthanur achaloyam sanatanah. So here further description of the nature of the soul is given. So he says this individual soul is unbreakable. It's insoluble. It can neither be burned nor dried. He is everlasting. Everything is destroyed, the entire material world is destroyed, but the soul will still last. It's present everywhere, sarvagataha, unchangeable, sthanu, you cannot change it. It's immovable, achalaha, and eternally the same, right? So here achala means that it does not loses its nature. Matter actually gets transformed, right? So matter moves. So here immovable in the sense that matter is prone to transformation. In that sense, matter is movable. But soul is not subject to transformation. In that sense, it's not movable. Just like even if you talk about uh, alloys or metals, right? So in heat, they expand, and when it's cold, they contract, and it could be micro inches, but it changes in its size. Then there is decay, right? So there is this idea of half-life of different atoms, where the nucleus decays, and number of protons or neutrons, they decay over a period of time. So exponentially, there's half-life, which is the principle based on which carbon dating method is based. When they look at any particular specimen, and they would say, well, this much carbon is depleted because the carbon decays, and it might decay over hundreds and thousands of years. But then based on that decay, they can estimate, well, if you kind of plot it on that exponential decay curve, then you can say that, okay, this came into existence this many hundreds and thousands of years ago because it has decayed by 50%, for instance, right? So everything decays, right? But such kind of decay or transformation is not subjected to the soul. It's always the same. So all these qualifications of the atomic soul definitely prove that the soul is eternally an atomic particle of the spirit whole. And he remains the same atom eternally without change, right? So an atomic particle of the spirit whole, again, means in a qualitative sense. So here Prabhupada again is explaining that the theory of monism is very difficult again to apply in this case, because individual soul is never expected to become one homogeneously. Even after liberation from material contamination, the atomic soul may prefer to remain a spiritual spark in the effulgent rays of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So see, the Vaishnava philosophy is not denying it. When the Brahman, when they impersonally say that, okay, one merges into the Brahman, we don't deny it. But when it merges, it doesn't mean that it becomes homogeneous. It still retains its individual identity as a spiritual spark. But beyond the Brahman again is the spiritual planets, right? And so those who are intelligent and those who have knowledge of the creation or existence beyond the Brahman, or the variety that exists within the Brahman. They want to find out the source of the Brahman. Where is the light coming from? And they want to enter the spiritual planets to associate with the personality of Godhead. Right. So it's a more holistic and a complete understanding of the truth. Here, the word Sarvagata is significant because there is no doubt that living entities, they exist all over God's creation. So there is no place where the living entities don't exist. So they are in the land, they are in water, there are air, earth, and even fire. You would earlier the idea was that, well, if you go deep down at the bottom of some of the deepest trenches in the ocean, right, which is the Mariana Trench, is the deepest out in the Pacific, close to Philippines. And when you go down all the way to these, further depths of the ocean, you see there's no life can exist because the sunlight never reaches there. There's no other forms of energy. But when the researchers went down, they were surprised to see forms of life that they had never imagined they exist. And the bottom of the ocean floor, there are volcanoes, and there are living entities inside that lava which is coming out of the volcanoes that emerge from the bottom of the ocean floor. And completely different biology that they kind of feeds on other forms of, could be nitrogen, or which we forms that we cannot imagine, but there's life existing everywhere. Or even, so that is fire, right? So lava, you can say it's form of fire, but the forms of life, they exist everywhere. And so even the Vedas or the scriptures, when they describe of the sun globe, right? So the sun again is represented. These beings, they are in subtle dimension. Of course, we cannot perceive with our eyes, but in the Bhagavad Puran is mentioned that the sun is actually yoked on a subtle chariot. Aruna Dev, he's pulling the chariot. Obviously, he's very close to the sun globe. And there are these sages called the Vahalikas. Was it? Sorry, always is a tongue twister whenever I try to pronounce that name. So the Aruna Dev sits in the front of the sun god, is engaged in driving the chariot and controlling the horses, but he's looking backwards towards the sun god. He doesn't want to show his back to the demigod of sun. And then there are 60,000 sages in front of the chariot, which are known as the Vali Kilyas. I always mispronounce his names. And each of them are size of the thumb. So again, you see, sun being so powerful and such a huge fiery ball of energy, like we being millions of miles away from it, we cannot even glance towards the sun for a moment. It's so glaringly hot. But then you see with this higher beings which have bodies by which they are not affected by this extreme heat. So in this way, the life is existing everywhere. The material forms might be different from what we are experienced with, but that nevertheless doesn't mean that life does not exist. Okay, any questions on that before we move on to the next verse? Okay, verse number 25. Avyaktoyam achintyoyam avikaryoyam uchyate tasmadevam viditvainam nanusochitum arhasi. Translation: it is said that the soul is invisible, is inconceivable, and immutable. Knowing this, you should not grieve for the body. So again, Krishna is providing different reasons to Arjuna, who is worried about the destruction of beings whom he identifies as his grandfather and teacher, but his identification is on a bodily platform. So Krishna is trying to bring him to, when somebody is overpowered by emotions, then one needs to be calmed down by grounding that individual in reality. And so Krishna is trying to provide him that perspective. So soul is, yes, invisible in the sense that avyakta, that is a Sanskrit use. You cannot describe it, because for describing something, you have to experience it through one of our five senses. And because the nature of the soul is, as we can say, it is not affected by any of the five elements. That means we cannot be, it also cannot be perceived by those five senses corresponding to those five elements. Just like fire is perceived by eyes, water is perceived by tongue and other senses, earth is perceived by primarily through smell, right? But soul has none of these five subtle perceptions, right, of form, touch, taste, smell, so you cannot perceive it. And so in that sense it is avyakta, you cannot describe it. It's invisible because again it's very minute, and even if it was large, again, it's not affected by fire. That means it doesn't have a form. If it doesn't have a form that the eyes can perceive, rather, it doesn't mean it doesn't have form at all, but the eyes can only perceive something that has that element or the characteristic of form, which in form is a characteristic of fire, right? Air does not have a form, but when air transforms into fire, it's the first element that has a form. So that's why the five senses, they are incapable of perceiving the soul, but its existence can be ascertained by other means. Just like I gave the example, an electron, no one can see an electron, but the presence of electron is determined when it distorts an electric field within an electron microscope. And that because that distortion is present, we can conclude that there must be some charge that is causing that distortion, and that charge can be described in terms of electrons. Similarly, the matter field, when it is distorted or transformed through 6 phases of birth, growth, sustenance, creating byproducts, dwindling, and death, then one can conclude the presence of the soul. Because if the soul is not present, these 6 distortions of matter or transformations of the matter field do not happen. Achintya, it's inconceivable. So obviously, we can only conceive what we have experienced, and it's difficult to conceive of which we do not have a direct experience. Just like electron, we can theoretically explain, but how do you really cannot conceive it, because you do not have direct experience through the 5 senses. There are theoretical models to explain it, but it's still an inconceivable thing, right? Ayam. So what to speak about the soul, right, which is even much more subtler. Avikarya, again unchangeable. So having known this, you should not lament. Purport. As described previously, the magnitude of soul is so small for our material calculation that we cannot even see it with a powerful microscope. So there are 2 aspects. One is size, another is that is quantity. Size is quantity, but there is quality also, in the sense that soul it does not have the characteristics of the 5 elements of ether, air, water, fire, earth, and so it cannot be perceived by 5 senses. Even by dimensional sense, you can say that maybe it falls dimensionally in the same size as maybe the soul or the protons or the quarks, for instance. Even if that was the case, you cannot directly see it with your eyes, right? Because just like not just eyes, but it's not simply a question of dimension, it's also the question of qualities by which you can perceive. Just like electron is perceived in an ethereal field because it distorts an ethereal field, because like electric field, electromagnetic field exists in the ether. That's why when you send a spaceship to different planets, they still communicate back to the earth through the space, through the ether, because electromagnetic waves, they are able to travel through ether and they distort that field. But because the soul does not have any ethereal properties, what to speak, talk about acoustic properties, or fiery properties, or viscous properties of the liquids, does not have any of that. So it cannot be detected even by the most subtlest of scientific instruments, which are primarily dealing with electromagnetic signals. So as far as the soul's existence is concerned, no one can establish its existence experimentally beyond the proof of the Shruti, right? But again, as I said, you cannot perceive by your senses, but its presence is detected because of the distortion it creates. So we have to accept this truth because there is no other source of understanding the existence of the soul, although it is a fact by perception. So what is Prabhupada referring by fact by perception? Is again, it's talking about the 6 transformation of the matters which cannot happen otherwise. No one can create those 6 transformations of matter that I talked about, right? It can only happen in the presence of the soul. So that's how one can conclude the existence of the soul. Okay, so there are many things we have to accept solely on the grounds of the superior authority. So many times the example is given that the fact that we exist, that means, we have parents, right? And so one has father and mother. But if somebody does not know who one's father is, right, then by experimentation, one cannot find out who the father is. One has to accept the authority of the mother. The mother knows who the father is, right? By experimentation, one cannot determine. Now, one might say, well, there are paternity tests available. You can go and do a DNA sampling, and you can see that if there is genetic match, and by that one can determine who the father is. But there are, there are billions of people on this planet, right? So where do you begin with, right? You cannot go and possibly check every single individual, right? It's not a practical approach. So even one has to begin with a smaller sample to do that test. Again, one needs an authority who can determine where to begin, right? So one has to start somewhere, and so in this case the authority is the mother. So the analogy is that the Vedas or the Vedic scriptures, they are considered mother of all the living entities, in the sense they provide guidance and teaching. And the spiritual masters or the gurus, the sages of the past who are explaining those scriptures, they are the father who guide also in the spiritual journey of the living entities. So I think Prabhupada explains this further. So there is no understanding, there is no source of understanding the identity of father except the authority of mother. Similarly, there is no source of understanding the soul except by studying the Vedas. In other words, the soul is inconceivable by human experimental knowledge. The soul is consciousness and conscious. That also is the statement of the Vedas, and we have to accept that. Unlike bodily changes, there is no change to the soul. As eternally unchangeable, the soul remains atomic in comparison to the infinite supreme soul. So here atomic again just doesn't mean in terms of size, but the fact that it could be influenced by matter. Just like a small spark of fire is influenced by earth or other elements when it's not in contact with the original source of fire. Similarly, here the supreme soul is infinite and the atomic soul is infinitesimal. That is the difference. Therefore, the infinitesimal soul, being unchangeable, can never be equal to the infinite soul or the supreme personality of Godhead. The infinitesimal soul, being unchangeable, though it is unchangeable, what it means, okay, just like the supreme soul is not changeable, the infinitesimal soul is also, not unchangeable. Despite of that, it cannot become equal to the infinite soul. This concept is repeated in the Vedas. So that is another difference. According to the Mayavadi theory, one becomes one with the Supreme and becomes one with him in all respects. But here he says that the soul, even after retaining its original spiritual identity, one does not become equal to the Supreme Personality of Godhead in all respects, right? And that truth is mentioned in different places in Vedic scriptures, just to confirm the stability of the conception of the soul. So that repetition is there. Why is repetition required? Like even if when I'm giving my explanation, there are some concepts we have repeated so many times. You might think like, why I'm just keeping on repeating same concept again and again. But by repetition, what happens is, the understanding becomes thorough. And each time that same explanation is repeated, when you hear that, hopefully with that each repetition, you get a better understanding, right? And that's true for any subject matter that we pursue. That as we spend more time and with more repetition, we have more realizations. So repetition of something is necessary in order that we understand the matter thoroughly without error. Any questions on this verse? Okay, verse number 26. अथ चैनं नित्यजातं नित्यं वां मन्यसे मृतं तथापि त्वं महाबाहो नैनं शोचितुम् अर्हसि. Translation: if however you think that the soul or the symptoms of life will always be born and die forever, you still have no reason to lament, O mighty armed. So here, Krishna is playing the devil's advocate. He's saying, well, if you are one of those individuals who believe that, you live and die once. So far Krishna is explaining, making arguments based on the understanding that, there is spirit soul, which is different from the body. And then that soul acquires new body. And so he's trying to explain from that perspective. But he says, well, if you still don't accept that there is spirit soul, still there is no reason to lament. If you think that this body is just simply a combination of different material elements, different chemicals, and then it has come into being at a certain point in time, and then when you die forever. Even if you believe this, there is no lamentation. Why? Well, the reason why you still don't lament is that, okay, if you are saying that this body is only temporary, it's still temporary, because right, it's just that coincidentally it has come into being because of chemical reactions. Then at the time of death, what's going to happen? These chemicals which have come together will again diffuse and merge back into the elements and will regain the same state that was existing prior to the creation of this body. So you're ending where you started. And then what's the need of lamentation? When you lament, when you were in a particular state of being, and that state of being actually is gone, right? Say prosperity. I was prosperous, but I'm not prosperous anymore. I had something which I have lost, and then I might lament for it. But he says, if you believe that everything is simply combination of elements of matter, then what was the beginning? In the beginning, there was nothing except the elements. And by chance or by combination, if the body came into existence, in the end, it is again merging into the same elements. And so it's regaining the same state that existed earlier. Then what's the reason to lament? So even if you accept that philosophy, there's no reason for you to lament. And that's the essence of the argument that Krishna is making. So here in the purport, Srila Prabhupada mentions that there is a class of philosophers which are almost like Buddhists. They do not believe in a separate existence of the soul beyond the body. So there's no distinction. I mean, I'm just one identity, and there's no, it's not that it is multi-layered. The existence is not multi-layered in terms of the soul, subtle body, and gross body. Even if one accepts that philosophy, Srila Prabhupada is mentioning there are philosophers who accept that philosophy. So when Krishna spoke Bhagavad Gita, it appears that such philosophers existed. So, all kind of philosophies exist at all points in time. It's just that, in certain times, one philosophy is more prominent or more prevailing than other philosophies, but that doesn't mean that other philosophies don't exist in that era, right? So different kind of philosophies always exist. So even in the past, uh, different kind of atheistic philosophies existed. It's not that there were no atheists in the past. So it appears that such philosophers always existed. They were known as Lokayatikas or Vaibhasikas. Such philosophers maintain that life symptoms take place at a certain mature condition of material combination. It says just the matter has to be in the right combination at right time. Then the life can come into being. So the modern material scientist and the materialist philosophers also think similarly. According to them, body is combination of physical elements, and at a certain stage, the life symptoms develop by interaction of the physical and chemical elements. Right. So this whole idea that even consciousness is a combination of chemicals, and at certain stage of development, life symptoms actually come into being. That's why this, I was mentioning in the previous class, there is a debate that you know those who are pro-choice, what they call pro-choice, in favor of abortions, like they say, at what state of the embryo development they should allow abortion, because they believe that only after certain stage life comes into being. Before that, life does not exist. And so when it is just simply a combination of matter and there is no life, then it's all right, to abort that embryo. So the roots of that philosophy is right over here. Even in the ancient times, there are philosophers called Lokayatikas and Vaibhashikas who had similar uh, uh, atheistic understanding of life. So the science of anthropology is based on this philosophy. Currently, many pseudo-religions, now becoming fashionable in America and everywhere else in the world, are also adhering to this philosophy. And they are all basically different variations of the nihilistic, non-devotional Buddhist philosophy. So in the Buddhism, it's they don't accept the existence of a personal God, and so there is no practice of devotion that you find in the Vaishnava traditions or even in Abrahamic tradition. In Abrahamic tradition, there is the idea of Allah, right, in the supreme being, and in Christianity also there is the idea of the supreme spirit, right, and so there is a lot of personal aspect of devotion. But in Buddhism, they only talk about nirvana. Nirvana means liberation, right? But then that liberation is not in pursuance of seeking association of any kind of supreme spirit. Now, in Abrahamic traditions, they might not have, they might have an impersonalist understanding of the supreme, but they say that, oh, there is a supreme, right? They're not denying the existence of supreme. But in the Buddhist philosophy, it's they completely deny the existence of the supreme. Their idea of nirvana is that, well, we are bound in this cycle of karma and we have to get out of this cycle of karma, but beyond that there is no such thing as supreme. You know what I mean? And so and in that sense, Mayavadi philosophy is also very similar to Buddhist philosophy in the sense that uh, instead of explicitly calling that supreme does not exist, they say that the supreme exists. But what is the nature of the supreme? They say, well, the nature of the supreme is that it has no form, no qualities, no pastimes, no attributes. It's all homogeneous. It's a covered atheism. It's an indirect way of presenting atheism. And we talked about in the past why that was done by Sankaracharya. He wanted to slowly bring back the faith in the Vedas that people had lost because of Buddhism. When Lord Buddha came, he rejected the Vedas because people are misinterpreting the Vedas to promote animal killing in the name of animal sacrifice. So he rejected the Vedas, but when they rejected the Vedas, it's one way to solve the problem, but then people stopped studying the Vedas. And Sankaracharya wanted to re-establish the faith in the Vedas, but then he cannot propose a philosophy that is drastically different from what people are used to thinking. And because the Buddhism was so prominent, even in India, India was all Buddhist when Shankaracharya appeared. Now the Buddhism is completely driven out of India. I mean, it's there in other parts of Asia because of Vaishnava acharyas like Sri Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, Nimbarkacharya. You know, they were no, sorry, say these Vaishnava acharyas defeated the Mayavadi philosophy. Sorry, before the but the Buddhists were driven by Shankaracharya himself. So Shankaracharya defeated the Buddhism. He said that no, don't accept Buddhism. Vedas are right. You know, don't reject the Vedas. You know, Vedas are true. But then he took present an understanding of Vedas that is not drastically different from what they are accustomed to. And they were accustomed to atheistic idea of Buddhism. So he had to present covered atheism. So he misinterpreted the Vedas for a higher purpose. And he said, no, there is God. It's not what Buddhists say that there is no God. There is God. But what is the nature of the God? Well, it has no form, no qualities, no attributes. How do you know? Well, I say, it's there in the scriptures. I'll prove it. So he was an expert grammarian. Again, he's an incarnation of Lord Shiva. He came for this particular purpose. And so he, by grammatical jugglery, you know, this root, you know, this principle of interpretation, he presented very impersonalist interpretations of those Brahma Sutras which were vague to begin with. I mean, they were not, you know, they were very easy to interpret, you know, could be subject to misinterpretation. So he did that. So there was a good reason why he did. But nevertheless, that is not the correct philosophy. So I know we are over time. I'll just take 1 minute to, you know, go over the essence of this paragraph and then we will stop. So yeah, the conclusion. So why is Krishna saying this? Krishna is saying, well, even if Arjuna did not believe in the existence of the soul, there is still no cause of lamentation. So I already talked about that. You know, the body will again merge into the elements. So why lament? So according to Vaibhasika philosophy, the so-called soul or Atma vanishes as soon as the body deteriorates. So for them, Atma is same as body. In any case, whether Arjuna accepted the Vedic conclusion or he did not, there was no reason for lament. So Krishna provided both arguments. If there was no rebirth for the soul, Arjuna had no reason to be afraid of being affected by sinful reactions due to his killing his grandfather and teacher, right? So he was saying that it's, you know, I'll be overcome by sin by killing those who are worthy of respect. But see, if you don't accept this philosophy of reincarnation, then there is no reason for you to worry about sin. As soon as you die, the body is finished and there is no more existence. You're permanently, one loses the existence. At the same time, Krishna sarcastically addressed Arjuna as Mahabahu, mighty arm, because he at least did not accept the theory of Vaibhasika. So Krishna knew that Arjuna does not believe in this theory, but he's just making an argument for the sake of, for the sake of argument, which leaves aside the Vedic wisdom. So Krishna knows that Arjuna is not a follower of Vaibhasika philosophy. As a Kshatriya, he was already following the Vedas, you know, Vedic injunctions of what the prescribed duties are. So all his life, he acted as an ideal Kshatriya, or the member of the Varnashram system, which is based on Vedic injunctions. And so there's no question of Arjuna not accepting the Vedic version. And since Arjuna belonged to the Vedic culture, it actually behooved him to continue to follow its principles. Okay, so I think we'll end the class over here. Is there any questions that I can quickly answer? I'm happy to take that. If not, we can conclude and we'll continue from next verse, which will be verse number 27. Anyone?
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Do you want to ask something?
No, I don't have questions. I said.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Hare Krishna.
Talk to you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.